Well, this is Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up a racket all night long. Let's talk a bit about Thanksgiving. We just went through it. Thanksgiving. How'd that happen? Well, let me go way back to a small group of Puritans that had defected from the Puritans. The Puritans were the political party and the church that took over Parliament and went to war with the crown, Charles I. Well, during that time when there was contention, just before that war started, a small sect of Puritans, Reformed they were, like the Scotch Presbyterians, Calvinist they were meeting in a barn on Sunday evenings at night so as not to be detected near a little town called Scrooby, 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 England. Well, the powers that be had their number. They weren't supposed to be doing that without a license. Of course, they said, we got authority, we got license, we got permission from God. We don't need it from the powers that be, the king. Well, they knew that wasn't going to last. Eventually, they migrated to the Netherlands, where the Dutch people live. They dug right in, went to work, became profitable citizens of the Netherlands. They liked them there. They built a church house there out of brick. You can go there and still see it. It's still there. The Puritans' old church, or the Pilgrims, they called them, but they were Puritans' old church house. Well, that went on for a while, and then they noticed that their children were learning things they didn't want them to learn from Dutch children. Well, what was it that they were learning? They were learning to be Dutch patriots, and they didn't want that. It wasn't that they were again the Dutch, but then they had the danger. Their children were willing to be conscripted and wanted to go to the Dutch army and fight Dutch wars. Well, that didn't set well with them. I mean, how would you feel about that if, for example, I knew a fella and his wife that wanted to move to Israel so their children could serve in the Israeli army. Now, I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but they're off a little bit. But they were Seventh-day Adventist, and they're off a little bit about a lot of things, and that was one of them. They wanted to be Israelites so bad. And, of course, they somehow didn't believe the Bible when it said you are the true Israel. If you trust in Jesus Christ, you are the Israel of God. Period. No provisos, no exceptions. And Jesus Christ said to the folks that called themselves Israel, that's pretty thin, the way you're acting. Well, at any rate, they didn't want their children to be in the Dutch army fighting Dutch wars. They were English, for crying out loud. They wanted to go to the land the Lord their God had given them. Well, then they went back. They said they can't take it. They were there about, I think something like 7, 9 years. I forget what it was. It was a spell. They were there for a spell. Well, they came back and they said, well, this isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to whoop the powers that be here unless we can get out of here. Now, England has land in America. They've claimed up some of it. Well, through a long series of machinations and promising they go there and make money for people. Never happened, but they made a promise. They got funded 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The Mayflower and the Speedwell. That means it speeds well. It was a lighter craft, smaller. I'm telling you things that I remember pretty much from growing up. Now, how I learned all this, I don't recall precisely. I've just remembered some of it, but I know some of it I got in the first grade when I went to school, when I was in the grades. Mrs. Zola Wolf taught us back then. she'd skinned my granddad out of a teaching job. You know, a woman can ask for less, and she did, and he didn't get the job. That was before I went to school, not long before. No, it was long before. That was his first teaching job in 1927. Well, he got a job, plenty of teaching jobs. Hard to find people to read, knew how to read and write, so they found one. They'd put him to teaching school. I knew another fellow down there. He got out of high school. Well, he was south of us, down in Richland County. He's 98 years old now, but when he got out of high school, they gave him a teaching job because, out of high school. They said, well, you must be really smart. And he taught school for quite a while. Well, I remember doing Thanksgiving at school. And I made a little drum because the Indians came, you know. And I had sad that thing got lost, had a leather top on a Folgers tin can about yay big, and then a bottom, and I could pound it like this, and I tied it, strung it down tight so it was taut. Teacher helped me a little bit. I was just a little shaver. I just turned 6, I guess. Well, then we had succotash that day because that's what the Pilgrims apparently had, succotash. Now, if you don't know what it is, you can go look it up, but we eat it at home a lot. It's good. You get about a gallon of succotash, and then put about a pound of butter on it and spread it around, let it run down through there. Put some bacon grease in it. I can inhale stuff like that. And you're thinking, well, what's succotash? Some of you know. Well, succotash is an American thing. Why? Because it has corn in it. Corn's an American crop. Well, they found the speedwell. When I was a boy, we used to go to the horse tank, my brother and I, and we had these 2 chunks of rail. I don't mean like steel rail. I mean rails like are split, and we made corn cribs out of them. We had 2 chunks with knots in them, and they were shaped kind of like boats, and we put them in the horse tank, and we called one the Mayflower, and we had Mayflowers at home. See, down the creek bottom, we stuck a Mayflower in the knothole in one. That was the Mayflower, and then the other one was called the Speedwell. Well, he was older. Dave, my brother, he got the Mayflower, and I got the Speedwell, and we'd race around the horse tank. How I learned that, I don't remember, except to know it was just part of being American, I guess. We just understood a lot of the things and knew the story. So I'm telling you what I remember. Well, the Speedwell, they got out of there finally. They had to sneak out. No, they didn't want them to leave. Why is it that evil governments don't want you to leave? They'll let people in, but they won't let them out. Why is that? Why is it you can go to a stinking filthy manure hole like San Francisco, Frisco, California, and it doesn't cost anything to get into town across the Golden Gate Bridge, but when you try to get out, it's financially prohibitive. You can't do it. Why is that? Doesn't cost anything to go across the Oakland Bay Bridge to a worse manure hole, Oakland, California, or just as bad. But to get out of there, they're going to charge you. They're going to make it almost impossible. Evil countries are that way. People couldn't get out of communist Germany, East Germany, communist Russia. Funny, isn't it? Why is it you get in the Mormon church? And I've known Mormons that have tried to get out of the Mormon church. They had to go to court just to get their names off the roll of the Mormon church. Why is that? Because once the devil's got you, he's not going to let you go. That's why. You know, there's in our common law tradition, which is Christian tradition, we have freedom of association. And then we have what we call freedom of disassociation. You can't have freedom of association, First Amendment of our Constitution of the United States, without freedom of disassociation. You got to have both. Like, if you're going to have the right to free speech, you got to have the right to remain silent. You got to have both, and we do. We protect them both. Our Constitution does. You don't like where you're going to church, go someplace else. You don't like living in California, the state of destruction, go to another state. That's the beauty of a Christian country. We have different sovereignties. You think that's not by design? You don't like one, you can go to another. You don't like this group, you can cut off from them and go to that one. You don't have a Christian country, you won't have that, friends. No, sir. At any rate, they couldn't get out. They finally snuck out and got on the speedwell, and the They jailed them just to try to keep them from getting out. You can go to the jail in England where they were jailed. The Pilgrims, 102 of them. 102 of them finally got on the Mayflower. Or no, well, that they did finally, but they were split between the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Most were on the Mayflower. They took off. They got about, I think, 4 or 5 days out near the Azores Islands or someplace. I don't know where it was. But they got out and the Speedwell sprung a leak. And they stopped. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get it to be seaworthy. So they were going to use the Speedwell Sea as a fishing boat. When they got over there, they were going to move on shore, and the Speedwell was smaller, and so they knew there were a lot of fish. They didn't have anything to eat over there. No crops, didn't know how to raise crops, didn't know what to expect, but they knew they could go out on the ocean and fish because English fishermen had been going there for decades. They'd never settled in America, but up around Newfoundland, they were making fortunes, catching fish, splitting them, cleaning them, drying them on the rocks out there, Newfoundland, and then taking them back to England and selling them. All up and down the coast, they were doing that. The fishing grounds were fertile. So that's what the Speedwell was for. Well, it sprung a leak. That didn't work. So they all piled on board the Mayflower, 102. 102. The sailors kept them down in the hold, stinking, rotten, a couple of months or something. But see, they didn't arrive until the 5th of November. That was too cold a time to arrive in New England. Too cold, way too cold. So they stayed on the ship after they arrived. They sent men ashore to spy the place out a little, look for wild savages that might try to eat them. Oh, they did eat people. There's no question about that. If you're not Christian, you'll eat people. Christianity teaches you're supposed to love your neighbor. If you stay with another religion long enough, or there's only one other one, but any other label of it, it'd be, in time, you'll be eating your neighbor. That's the only choices you have in life. You eat him economically. You eat him physically. That actually happens all over the world. Oh, Brent, people don't do that anymore. I've been to places in the world, well, it was 50 years ago, I was at a place in the world where cannibals were eating people. I didn't venture off beyond the pale, as they used to say in Northern Ireland. I didn't go beyond the pale. My life wouldn't have been worth much. The wild monkeys didn't get me, then the cannibals would. Well, as you see, they didn't. Fortunately for me. Well, they were looking for that, but most of the time they stayed on the ship for 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Get this. They disembarked. They arrived on November the 2nd. 102 souls. 102 souls. They weren't even let out of the hold. It was stinking, filthy, rotten, no way to wash yourself. Can you imagine? Down there in the hold of that little ship. See, they were piled up. That's why they had 2 ships. Now they got one. They're all piled up down in there, and it stunk. Sailors wouldn't, well, the old man of the ship wouldn't let them light any fires. They couldn't cook anything. Everything they ate for those months was dry and cold. Finally got here, 5th of November, 5 weeks on the ship, didn't have any shelter, didn't know where to go. If they went ashore, they'd have froze to death. Nothing to eat. They went ashore on Christmas Day, 1620, the year 1620. And that's in the dead of winter in New England, and they began to build a common house. A common house. Because many of them were sick and dying by that time. The voids and the filth will kill you, friends. And if you don't have clean habits, you're just downright godless. Cleanliness is not next to godliness. You read the Bible, you discover that cleanliness is godliness. It's not a matter of being sterile or having some technique. It's just a matter of doing this or that, whatever the book says. It's that simple. That's simple. You can overdo it. Don't overdo it. Do what the Bible says. But there are principles of cleanliness there. Well, they started dying. Before it was over, 50 of them had died, 50 of 102, if I remember my numbers right. Just that, the few short months of that winter, 50 died. And I'm saying before, from November the 5th to March 16th, and I'll tell you why that's a significant date of the year 1621. Just short of half of them died. They built that common house, that common meeting house, and that's where they brought them from the ship, the sick, and they put them in there, and the ones that were left nursed them back to health at the risk of their own lives, fed them, dressed their meat. When it was all over, there were only three families left with a mother and father. 14 of the fathers died, and I think there was about 37 fathers. 14 died that winter, just within 3 months, up until November 5th to March 16th. Well, the captain of the Mayflower withheld himself from returning to England. He could have returned he could have just dumped them off and skedaddled. He didn't. He stayed there so they would have shelter before they got their common house built. But then he decided to leave. By the way, his crew, I think 4, and there weren't many on the crew of the ship. It was small compared to ships today. 4 men died while they were there. The filth had spread. Well, then, on the 16th of March, of course, they were watching for Indians all the time. They knew there were hostile ones out there, and they knew that they'd killed many Englishmen already before. That's why no Englishman ever went ashore. They'd fish, but they wouldn't come ashore. They'd come ashore to get supplies, water, food. They needed to find some, wood, but only heavily armed with an armed contingency, and even then, some of them got killed and eaten. Now, you got to picture these Indians. I'm going to talk about one in a minute. At that time, well, it was the 16th of March. There was a little warming of the weather, and the men they kept a guard all the time. And one of the men on watch said, "Injun coming." And they had a main street. They'd had some buildings built by then, a few. So they had kind of a street laid out. And coming up the middle of the street come this Injun, walking like he owned the place. Great big tall galoot. And it's not said much, but we know from paintings and accounts written at that time in New England that the tribes up there were very fond of tattooing their entire bodies in the most hideous ways, and this one was like all the rest of the men. You didn't have tattoos, you weren't a man. That's what they thought. So his whole body, his face, his head, everything. So he was quite a sight, and all he had on, it had warmed up a little, all he had on was a small cloth of some kind or some kind of a skin around his private parts. He was an aborigine. Scary looking. So the men got together in front of the meeting house, had their weapons, and they just stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. And this Injun just walked, great big fella, bigger than them, walked right up to him, held up his hand like this. And what do Injuns say in the movies? They say, "How," right? Or something like that. He didn't say that. He held up his hand and he said, "Welcome." Just like that. Well, it took them a while to catch their breath after that one. Kind of bowled them over backwards. So they gathered their wits about him, and before they could respond, you know what he said next? This is this reveals humanity. He said in broken English, "You guys got any beer?" "You guys got any beer?" Or however he said it. Broken English is what people said it was. Well, come to find out, this fellow's name was Somerset. He was friendly, and he gave him a history lesson, told him what had happened to the hostile tribe there that was murdering and eating people. I just remember their name. It was kind of long. They lived about 40 miles. Well, this fellow lived about 40 miles away from Plymouth in what is now today Rhode Island. And he was a member of a tribe, and he said that the most vicious tribe there that were just slaughtering other tribes and slaughtering any white men that came around and torturing them. All of a sudden, a couple of years before, a plague had struck the tribe and wiped them out to a man. They lived right there at Plymouth. Wiped them out to a man and a woman. They're gone. Well, he visited a while, and he said, well, I'm going to go back home about 40 miles away. I've been watching you from a distance, but he had learned English from the English fishermen that had come there. He said, I'm going to bring another fellow back that'll talk to you because he knows English better than me. So he comes back in a few weeks, and he has this fellow with him by the name of, starts with an M. Very famous. He's the one that taught them how to farm. He was the chief of the tribe. It'll come to me later. Maybe some of you know it. He came with 60 armed warriors, and he was decked out in full regalia. We're talking about earrings and tattoos and headdresses. And so the pilgrims, the militiamen, they put on a show. They had their weapons out, and they had their trumpets, and they had their drums beating, and they had the whole caboodle, and they showed off, and then they exchanged gifts. And then, almost had a muscle. Starts with an M. Then he sat down and spoke perfect English, like an Englishman. And they come to find out he'd been in England. He'd spent 9 years in England. He'd been kidnapped. He was 9 years in England. Probably got to talk to the king and the queen, a whole bunch of people, and they took him around and showed him off. The fishermen had captured him. So he'd learned English, and somehow he persuaded some sailors to smuggle him aboard and take him back home. Well, he got home, and his tribe was wiped out. Nothing left but skeletons laying around this village. And, of course, that was depressing. And then he got adopted by this other tribe, and he became the chief man. Of course, he knew a little English. He had a little Christianity infused into his culture. Not to say the man was Christian, but he'd had that influence. This is the importance, friends, of Christian culture. It makes men powerful, not in bodily strength necessarily. It makes them powerful of spirit. And to be around it even, if you're not even born from above, you enjoy. Like the Bible says, the Christian husband sanctifies the Christian wife, or the non-Christian wife, and the Christian wife sanctifies the non-Christian husband. What does that mean? Fancy word. It means it sets him apart like her. Now, how far that goes, we'll have to study the Bible more to see, but I'm making a point that if there are Christian folk around, God blesses, and everybody that's close by enjoys a bit of the blessing of the power of the Spirit. Well, this fella, his name starts with an M. He taught them how to throw fish in the hills of corn so that the corn would produce. And Americans began to do that to the point where over 200 years later, Daniel Webster, senator from New Hampshire, was buying hogsheads. That's a barrel bigger than 55 gallon, full of fish, and having them spread on his farmland. That's good fertilizer. It really works. Well, because of that, he saved their lives. Because he had went to England, because he knew English, because he understood the English folk, because he wanted to be friendly with English folk when they tried to settle there. He was willing to help them survive. And they became prosperous, and that was the beginning of American prosperity from the red men that lived here that had a touch. And you don't think that God is behind all that? Of course he is. There had been one other settlement of Englishmen in the New World, and that was at Jamestown in the year 1607. And although nobody knows what happened to them, whether they got wiped out by the wild Indians or died of disease or both, they disappeared. There was nothing left. And all we can find now, we're trying to dig things up. I've been there. They've dug a few things up that they had there, but they didn't last. And that's why it took another 13 years before anybody got serious about trying to settle there. It was foreboding. It was dark. It was dangerous. And that danger continued until the end of the Apache Wars. And the Apache Wars ended. People think they ended with the surrender of Geronimo. They didn't. That was an important event in 1885, I believe, or 81, or somewhere back there. But the Apache Wars did not end, and the raids did not end until 1934. They stayed in the Sierra Madres and wandered back and forth because the Sierra Madre Mountains go down into Mexico and up into Arizona. And that was their domain. And that's where they lived. And you didn't dare go in there. Well, that was the beginning, though. And they made a treaty with them that lasted 25 years with the Pilgrims, and that enabled the Pilgrims to get going good, and get going good they did. Well, this is Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up a racket all night long.